Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Shihoko Goto and Meg Lundsager. Shihoko is Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Associate for Northeast Asia with the Wilson Center's Asia program, and Meg is a Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow and a former U.S. Executive Director for the International Monetary Fund, and they join us today to talk about the state of the IMF and the future of that organization. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us, and good to see both of you.
Thank you.
Let me begin with, before we talk about the new leader, Kristalina Georgieva, who became managing editor on the 1st of October, let's take a look back at her predecessor, Christine Lagarde. In Georgieva's speech at the recent meetings, she said this about Lagarde, that she made the IMF stronger, more innovative, and more relevant. Is that a proper assessment of the Lagarde legacy?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, Christine Lagarde really, I think, turned the institution around when it was really in a very dire situation after Strass-Kahn's, the scandal related to that and his hasty resignation. So she came in, she changed the image of the institution. She very much elevated the role of women, not only within the organization, but also around the world, pointing out how important it is to broaden the participation in the economy in many countries. If they're, for instance, in Japan, if they're going to grow more rapidly, have a more successful future. So she had a lot of themes she pursued, and at the same time, she was very much focused on the core IMF mandate, which is macroeconomic stability, fiscal policy, monetary policy, exchange rates, and financial sectors. So I think she did a very good job in really giving the institution a lot of self-confidence, assurance, and willingness to work on some of the really front burner issues of the day that are a little bit outside the IMF mandate, but facing all the membership, all the countries.
She certainly managed to seem to use that platform or exploit that platform, I mean that in the positive sense, in a way that her predecessors had not. She wandered around the world stage like almost a head of state.
She did. That's really interesting, isn't it? She definitely has a lot of star power.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of respect for her leadership as well. And I think it elevated the conversation about the IMF as an institution and the role of women. And I really like the fact that she talked about the need for women in the financial sector, which is really underrepresented by women. And she also said something like, when there is a crisis, people always call the woman to come in to bail them out. And I think this was certainly that case.
Certainly on the micro level, many people can relate to that. So let's talk about her predecessor, and based on your assessment of the Lagarde legacy, who has big shoes to fill right here. What do we know about her? Well, she describes herself as growing up behind the Iron Curtain, somebody from Bulgaria who is hard for her to imagine that she is where she is today based on where she spent her childhood and how she spent her childhood.
Well, she went to Karl Marx University, so there you go. Quite a change for the IMF, but the little bit I've seen of her in action, and it's only been a few weeks, I mean, her speeches, her public outreach, looks like she's very much taking charge and very capable, seems very relaxed in her role, pushing on some of the key issues that are important to her and to the global economy, certainly on the concerns about trade, on growth slowing down, on the need for fiscal, let's say, fiscal stimulus in countries that can afford to do so. So I think she has been an incredibly smooth transition and has shown herself ready to take charge.
In her inaugural speech, Shihoko, she said that the purpose of the IMF is delivering for the people. Now, Meg gave us the various things that the IMF does on a technical level. This is more thematic or aspirational. Is how she is describing the institution seeing itself, how the world views the IMF?
Yeah, I think her personal background is very compelling in this as well, because she is from Eastern Europe. The IMF has traditionally been led by European, but usually a West European. She has been through the seismic change of post-communist Eastern Europe rebuilding. And today we are finding a situation not unlike that. We are in the forefront of the fourth industrialized revolution. There's a lot of anxiety about economic disruption, people left behind, winner takes all kind of economic systems emerging. Even those who are doing well today are uncertain about what the future may hold. So there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear that is driving politics, that's also driving economic policy as well. And so by being aware of that and being able to elevate the conversation, I do think she plays an extremely important role.
I'm going to ask you to put your heads together and come up with her to-do list. What are the main challenges facing the institution? What are some of the bumps in the road? How do they continue to remain relevant and evolve with a changing landscape? I'll be the stenographer. I'll take notes, but both of you can come up with a to-do list.
I think it's really a very difficult time for the institutions because a lot of the work that needs to be done is the countries themselves. And as we've seen, anybody who looks at the newspaper, follows what's going on, countries seem to be moving further apart and not willing to work together. And we see this mainly in the trade disputes that the U.S. has engaged in terms of China, other countries. But we also see slowdowns in a number of countries that are, in some respects, internally generated, not just because of the trade, and an unwillingness, or I don't know if it's conscious or sort of unconscious ability to see the impact that has on neighboring countries and others and their responsibility. For instance, in Germany, to help revitalize Europe. I mean, the countries in the southern tier really are still struggling to deepen economic growth, to bring back investment and productivity increases. And I think Germany feels very comfortable where it is by itself, but at the same time, it's a member of this monetary union, so it's very deeply linked to all the other economies in Europe. And so I see this in country after country, this turning inward, not just the trade disputes.
Are you describing what the current U.S. President, Donald Trump, capsulized in his America First slogan? Are you suggesting globally that's the phenomena, this nationalistic populism movement that seems to have many countries, while not expressing it as explicitly as Donald Trump, going it on their own?
No, I do see that. And of course, we saw that in the big pushback in Europe on immigration. But here we have the United Kingdom leaving the European Union and feeling they'll be better off on their own than as part of this economic union. We see this in other countries in Asia where they're very dependent on the international trade and investment, but nonetheless feel that they need to protect themselves and strengthen their own economies. And then that's their primary focus. So China's very much focused on improving investment in human capital, moving up the technology chain for their own reasons, aging population, shrinking workforce now. And so it's like we have to do that ourselves, and so the trade helps, but it's very important. So they're putting that priority first, just as the United States has, just as Germany has, other countries. So it's difficult to see what will galvanize all of us to wake up, all our countries to wake up and see that if we don't turn things around and try and come up with some cooperative solutions, we're all going to be looking at a slow growth, lower job creation in the future, and lower productivity and investment. So, but that sense hasn't really become widespread at this point.
I said I'd take notes. I'm going to put that one down as herding cats, as the challenge.
It is the herding cats, definitely.
But if I could also add, why was the IMF established in the first place?
Back to the
right?
roots.
So,
and here's a little book. That
yes, a little book
by coincidentally.
Well, help
so
put it together.
Lessons learned. It was out of necessity, not because of some altruistic. We must do something just for the sake of it. It was the lesson from World War I was that reparations payment really crippled Germany. There was a lot of financial instability across these countries, and they could have all benefited from more coordination between them. Mm-hmm. And so when you have a more pluralistic approach to dealing with a financial challenge that would impact not only that particular country, but all countries, it makes sense to have that collective gathering. And that's what we mean when we talk about multilateral cooperation. The real test of the IMF, though, is going to be, can it deal with the financial crisis, at the level that we saw 10 years ago or in Asia 20 years ago. And
you're talking about the financial crisis to come.
Yes, exactly. The financial crisis to come. Hopefully there won't be, but it seems like there are very dark, big clouds on
You wouldn't
the
be on an
horizon.
island if you said that you think one is on the way. A lot of economists have said that.
So then that's the test of the IMF.
So I should say the book that we were referring to, Revitalizing the Spirit of Bretton Woods, 50 Perspectives on the Future of Global Economic Systems, So we're talking about an institution that was born in the aftermath of World War II. I guess planned in 1944 and then actually opened its doors in 1945.
Right.
So that raises a relevancy question. Are institutions that were built in a particular context for a particular purpose still relevant today without a major rethinking of their mission and their purpose?
Well, what's been amazing at the IMF over the many decades is how it has reinvented itself many times as the global economy has changed, as countries' needs have changed. So originally, it was an institution that was going to police countries keeping their currencies, exchange rates fixed. And when that all fell apart in the early 1970s, the U.S. went off the gold standard. We introduced flexible exchange rates. The IMF modified how it did things, and everyone back then thought, well, why do we need an IMF then if everyone has flexible exchange rates? Well, lo and behold, we've had one crisis after another, debt crises in many countries, and the IMF has always been there to help pull together sort of the core adjustment program in countries and to help manage the financing of an orderly workout. And I think that's going to happen again. We're going to see countries in debt crisis again. There are a number of them already that are approaching very high limits. So far, so good. The markets are rolling it over, financing again. But Argentina will be a key test as we have a new government most likely coming in after elections. And how they'll cooperate, how they'll manage their economy will be a real test. But the IMF always stands ready to help its members.
Are they up to the task? I mean, this is a big job. You're asking one institution to kind of rein in the chaos.
And I think one challenge it will face politically is the voice of governments that are represented. And so it has, again, the IMF is always headed by a European, the World Bank is always headed by an American. Is that really reflective of the world today? Is there an opportunity for us to really rethink how the leadership is selected and what the priorities of the institution should be? There is a lot of scope for improvement in that, but I do think that both the IMF and the World Bank are not unaware that they should be addressing.
And speaking of China, well, indirectly, in a sense, because certainly you can't talk about global economics without talking about China, and this paradigm of Europe-US that was set up after World War II certainly made sense then. But what is China's view of the IMF, and what is their involvement? Are they constructive players? Are they team players?
They are, and this was something I saw in my many years at the IMF. China has decided it wants to be a player and wants to be part of this system. So it has been very deeply engaged, a very key player in the IMF. It's a big lender to the IMF. It provides quite a bit of financing to the IMF, as do many of the stronger economies around the world. And I felt there has been a constructive participant in the different policy debates. Did we see the U.S. and China eye to eye on everything? No. But with a lot of work and building international consensus, that's what I always felt I had to do in my years at the IMF. Build that international consensus if we wanted to move the institution in a direction that we think would benefit not just the United States, but the global economy. And that took bringing sometimes China along, bringing other countries along. So I do see them as constructive. But with that said, China will be putting China first, and it'll need to meet its own needs. So far, that has coincided, I think, with working well with the IMF. We'll see as we go forward. But to get anything done at the IMF, you need a broad consensus among the membership.
In her inaugural speech, again, I quote from Kristalina Georgieva's speech. She quoted one of the founding fathers of the institution, John Maynard Keynes, and she said that he had said this: "Economics is essentially a moral science and not a natural science. That is to say, it employs introspection and judgment of values." If I'm interpreting this correctly, it sounds directly in opposition to the world you described today, where it's almost every nation for itself.
Maybe that's still the sense, but what happens is next time there's a big crisis and we all wake up and realize we need our economic partners to work our way out of this and for all of us to manage and put a floor under how serious it is, I think they'll come back and realize that international cooperation is very important. I mean, certainly central banks understand their deep linkages, cross borders, because of the trillions of dollars that cross borders and are invested in other countries, not just our own. So I do see that while, yes, judgment and nationalism seems to be rearing its head, ultimately, when things get really bad, we need each other.
One difference, though, is not going to be in the IMF, but it's actually going to be with the World Bank. That is to say, the role of development assistance. How do we deal with poverty alleviation worldwide, or going up the economic ladder? What kind of financial assistance should we give? And there can be a lot of differences between China and a US-led order as well. And so that's where the values will possibly clash. We're seeing that already with a Chinese vision of economic development through the Belt and Road Initiative, and many countries are signing on to that. They have benefited from it. Countries like the United States are not as aggressive in providing infrastructure development financing. China is. So there is a lot of competition in that front, and that would only accelerate in coming years.
You've touched on a lot of headlines and teased out trend lines as well as far as the big picture. I want to get a final thought from each of you within that context. In other words, an immediate headline might be Argentina's pending election and their economic struggles. But then on those trend lines, we're talking about this sort of nationalism that has swept the planet. Looking ahead, what are the key trend lines you're going to be watching that will make this institution's road or path clear, where it needs to intervene, where it needs to be a player? And essentially, I'm asking you to kind of gaze into the crystal ball and help us navigate where the global economy might be headed and what the IMF's role in that will be.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm worried about is financial stability across countries. And right now, everything seems to be okay. Our equity markets. Stability-wise, but there are huge sums of money moving around the world. A lot of it's in the, to use a slightly pejorative term, the shadow banking, or in the non-bank sector, and it's much less regulated and much less visible. It's not captured in a lot of the statistics.
Is that a trend? Is more
Yeah, it is a trend, and that's going into emerging markets. It's going in and out of China as much as the Chinese will allow it, and certainly crossing borders among the advanced economies. And the question is, if there's a hint of a crisis somewhere, does that money quickly pull back? And what does that mean? Is that what then triggers a crisis, and then we have a rolling chain of problems, as we've had in these other crises, the Asia crisis, Latin America, where the contagion, it moves from one country to the other? That will be a real test for the IMF, and that'll be such huge sums of money. It will need to corral countries to do a lot of the working out how we're going to repair the system and
many of those
forward.
countries are stretched thin already.
They're already stretched thin, exactly. And so it'll be a real, I mean, it was difficult for the U.S. in the 08-09 crisis. The first time the TARP went to Congress, it was voted down. And stock markets, other markets just absolutely just plummeted. Fear came back into the equation, and then they passed it. So I hope it doesn't take getting that bad to trigger cooperation and, sort of mutual workouts of the problems that
And the
may
U.S.
emerge.
deficit wasn't quite that large at that
The
point.
U.S. deficit wasn't that large, exactly.
Shihoko, you're
Yeah, so technology is obviously something that really concerns us, but one specific issue related to that is cryptocurrency. So outside of the governance of traditional governments, right now there's a lot of talk about alternative currency mechanisms. If this takes flight, what happens when things go down south? Is there a way for international institutions like the IMF or any government to actually intervene? And if not, what's going to happen? So that's really outside of the scope of what the IMF and central banks are doing right now. But that fear is already on the horizon.
You're describing these disruptive forces that are not coming upon us in an orderly fashion.
Right.
It's not a
It won't be
Keynesian
orderly.
economic model.
It won't be
There's
orderly.
a theory. It's almost from the inside out reforming itself. Well, fascinating stuff, and I'm going to hide my money in a pillowcase if I had any to hide. Meg Lundsager, Shihoko Goto, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Navigating these very complex issues. Thank you as well for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.